High school theater is pitch black. Lights from above shine on six young Black, Latinx, and Polynesian students standing on the stage. A Latinx student is bent over a brown wooden cane at the stage center. He is dressed in raggedy jeans, a worn plaid shirt, and a tattered camouflage headband. He gazes intently across the audience and carefully recites the end of his monologue. Giving money is not going to solve all our problems. What we really need to do is spare change, make change, wake change, create change. He finishes by gently prodding the audience. Can you help us? Can you spare some change? Suddenly, there are red and blue lights, and a police siren echoes across the theater. An adult white man enters from stage right. He is dressed as a police officer. What's going on here? We're having complaints about you. Let me see your ID. When the student feigns resistance, the police officer yells, All right, that's enough out of you. I'm tired of your crap. The police officer grabs the arm of the student and throws him face down on the ground. The Polynesian student on stage calmly walks towards the police officer with his hands up. He cautiously challenges the officer. Hey, all that ain't necessary. Then the lights abruptly shut off, leaving the audience dark. Simulated gunshots loudly play over the speakers. The lights come back on, and the Polynesian student stands stage center, choreographing shock. He's been shot. So, what I just read for you was the beginning of a monologue of a production written by the courageous writers at this specific school called the Bay Grove School, a very limited, almost completely minority driven school. And they have a culturally sustaining pedagogies program, but because of the white teacher creating an opportunity for these students to really kind of like dig deep and dive into their personal circumstances within the school and their environment. It's primarily Hispanic, Black, and Polynesian. And all of the stories are driven from that factor. Okay, so what I want to kind of clarify what I'm getting this article from. The article is called Policing and Performing Culture, Rethinking Culture, and the Role of the Arts in Culturally Sustaining Pedagogies. And this chapter is taken from the book Culturally Sustaining Pedagogies, which is one of our reading materials for this class. Okay, it's a fascinating article, and it's kind of driven a lot of other things that I'm trying to pursue with involving the role of the arts with culturally sustaining pedagogies. And so I'm very excited to kind of like walk you through this whole chapter. So once again, I'm using the software of the brain. And the center topic is culturally sustaining pedagogies, CSP. Okay, and one thing I want to clarify as a definition is a commitment to sustain that which sustains us. That is sustaining the lives of our students is paramount. CSP then moves beyond sustaining languages and cultures to sustaining people who speak and enact those languages and cultures. Okay, so as you see, I have several main topics, and these main topics are space, culture, and the role of arts in CSP. And then I also, from this mind map and chapter, have gathered 3 different kind of lingering topics or overarching kind of concepts within the chapter. And those are the school to prison pipeline, sustaining survival and sustaining liberation, and lastly, pain and joy. So first, I would say out of all the different topics, the one that came out the most was space. So space, more than anything else, was kind of like the overarching concept or theme of this entire chapter. And as you see, I have 7 different like concepts of the idea of space within this chapter. The first one being out of school spaces, second one, temporal space. Third, providing additional space for collaboratively and individually envisioning social change. And kind of like the concept behind that is CSP is rooted in a legacy of minority communities and students finding belongings in their learning process and feeling the need to move their learning beyond the classroom towards social justice or social action. Schooling space, quite an interesting concept, I think. But as a kind of analogy or a literary space beyond that, as a critical pedagogies, educators using CSP cannot and should not sustain only the aspects of students' lives that are safe or easily addressable in schooling spaces. Okay, so it's more of a challenging aspect. Space as a way to engage and belong. I think at the critical core, that's what the arts provide for space and what I've been interested in. Critical spaces. Here is an interesting quote from the chapter. How can we provide spaces for students to be critical of society, yet also imagine and enact a world of joy beyond the intersecting oppressions that attempt to circumscribe their lives? And my last one is this concept of a third space. So where the cultures of students and their communities are sustained, extended, and complicated outside of the dichotomy of reproduction and resistance, where human agency, complicity, and resistance live together in pedagogies towards liberation. And liberation is a very key term with this entire chapter as well. So the third major concept of this whole chapter, culture, space, and then finally the role of the arts in CSP. There are two different concepts within this. The first one being the carceral state, where students critically engage through art in a way that created a schooling space that sustained them. And I even can go further on that with the author of Michel Foucault, who more so than any other philosopher talks about the concept of carceral society, which refers to the spreading of techniques or regulating human behavior and surveillance processes typical of modern prisons beyond or throughout society as a whole. The other aspect of the role of arts in CSP is that it is critical in establishing how we understand critical sustaining pedagogies. Okay, so we cannot fully integrate and understand the concept of this way of knowing without involving the arts to kind of like completely collaborate and beyond that aspect, be a part of it, which I'm all in favor of, obviously. So we have three components that really are this kind of like overarching concept or idea. The first one is school to prison pipeline in the article. And one of the major topics is that minorities have just never had the opportunity to go to college. And the reason why the retention rate or the percentage of students going to college as opposed to not going to college is so high is because these students have been objectified and pulled towards the school to prison pipeline. That's one major concept in a chapter. The second one is understanding the difference between sustaining survival and sustaining liberation. And what they identify is that sustaining survival is more of a kind of reactionary standpoint, whereas sustaining liberation is using the things that they have to go beyond it. Okay, and that's kind of a continuum that I'm going to continue talking about in future
chapters and in future articles. Okay. The last thing I wanted to mention is the concept of pain and joy. So in the beginning of the chapter, it talks about how despite all of these negative things, you can still find joy in certain things. But once we get to the end of the chapter, we realize that joy cannot truly provide everything that we're looking for as a recognizable concept or analogy. And so a quote from the book: as we continue to theorize CSP as a collective, our work moving young people toward liberation requires us to pay equal attention to pain and joy. You could not truly understand the concept of joy if there is no reference opposite of it. Okay, these students, these learners have been through so much, and yet they can understand what joy or happy or accomplishment means because of what they've been through. And so it's imperative to acknowledge that not only is the end or objective or outcome to this concept joy, but we cannot follow this path and this process without understanding where the pain was driven and started to begin with. So that's basically the summarizing aspect of this whole chapter. I would be more than willing to share, or go ahead and just open up the book and start with page 117 and find out all the fascinating and fun things with this chapter. I learned a lot about this chapter, and it's going to continue to inform my practices, and I hope you learn from it too. I look very much forward to hearing and understanding your thoughts on what I have read about as well. So have a wonderful night. Bye. Okay, so I began this, I began with a monologue from this particular Polynesian artist and student or learner. And I read this whole monologue, and I ended with him being shocked and understood. And so I think it's only fair that I conclude this whole statement of how he finished the monologue in the end. Forgive me because this is done in rap. I'm not going to be doing it in rap, but I think you might find it interesting how he concluded his whole monologue with the process that he went through. Got my mother, my father, my sisters, my brother, my aunties, my uncles, my nieces, my nephew, my cousins, my grandma, my grandpa. Who's gonna miss me? But now let me come back to reality. Life just ain't that easy. All these shootings make me feel like a target. Why do you feel like a target? Target. If the po-po going loco with all of us locals, they just none but murderers coming at me, fool, and I never heard of ya. Now before you take my life, just know it ain't so right to kill an innocent because he ain't white. Now let me take my last breath, looking up at the sky, 'cause I'm about to fly high with the angels in the sky.